Hi, welcome to Psyphilopod. My name is Bo Winegard, broadcasting from an undisclosed location in Marietta, Ohio, because I'm an assistant professor of psychology at Marietta College.
Does that make me Cory Clark, broadcasting from an undisclosed location in Durham, England, because I'm a professor in England?
I'm an assistant professor of social psychology.
Oh, an assistant
You
professor
looked
in England.
genuinely puzzled as though I thought I was Bo
I
Winegard.
was a little perplexed, yeah.
Okay. Today we're going to talk about activism in science, whether activism it is or should be a part of science, or whether the only activism in science, as you would say, should be truth activism.
Yeah. So I made this claim that the
Yes.
only kind of activism that should prevail in science is truth activism, and I thought it was interesting because I got a lot of pushback on that.
Yeah, I might
So
push back on it potentially.
yeah, yeah. So I thought it was interesting. Maybe it tells us something interesting about our views of how science should work, or maybe a lot of these debates that we have about issues such as research into sex differences or race differences. Potentially, some of the reason we have such ferocious disagreements about them is because we actually have disagreements about the purpose
Hmm.
of science.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And there are plenty of smart people doing good work who would straight up say that certain topics absolutely should not be touched, regardless of whether you would be coming to a closer understanding of the truth. And so I think there's a lot of disagreement about whether we can ask all kinds of questions or whether we should only ask questions and only search for answers that actually can make the world a better place. Or
Right.
certainly avoid the ones that could be very harmful.
Yeah, so let's just start there. So the most abstract question we can have is prescriptively, that is, how should it be? What should science be? Now, I think we want to reserve our conversation to the social sciences because these questions get a little more difficult in chemistry and physics, I think.
I like to have the comparison though, because I think probably different categories of science might need different norms or something,
Right,
or
I agree
rules.
with that. That's why I'm saying I think unless I say otherwise, I'm thinking about social science because if you're talking about, for example, I'm taking this idea from a philosopher of science, but let's say you figure out that the exact right kind of combination of 15 vegetables, if you cook it together, will blow the whole world up. Okay, well, yeah, that's a really dangerous thing, and I don't think I'd promulgate that to the
Yeah, I was
public,
thinking
right?
like if like a biologist or something discovers this thing that you could spread that would wipe out all humans, should we like
Right,
promote their work? Should
right,
we, even if they're discovering something potentially interesting, uh,
right.
is there any value to that? Maybe not.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm going to mainly focus. I'm just going to be thinking about the social sciences. So my argument is the goal of the social sciences should be purely and simply to understand human behavior, human nature, and how it interacts with society, and that there should not be the actual practice of science should not be infused with moral claims or moral suspicions or moral concerns even. The only concern should be for the truth and for understanding humans.
So that's what you think the goal of science, of social science, should be.
That's right.
So does that mean that we aren't supposed to ask potentially dangerous questions or that we're supposed to censor potentially dangerous findings? That does not
That
mean.
means that we don't censor anything because our goal is to discover the truth. And that,
But
I
then
mean, we could,
how are you saying the social sciences are so different from say like biology if a potential research finding really could be catastrophic in the way like some disease or some whatever bacteria or something could be.
Because we have absolutely no evidence that there's anything in the social sciences that's even remotely similar to that.
we we have no evidence in the social sciences that any of our ideas are really doing all that much in general.
Yeah, nobody seems to care about the social sciences in general. No, I mean, this
They
is
probably
precisely
are
why
less consequential, honestly.
yeah, I think social scientists
Less
tend
potential
to
anyway.
yeah, we tend to exaggerate how much people give a hoot about our studies, but setting that aside, that's why I'm trying to make a distinction between, let's say, physics and the atom bomb and social sciences, in which there's just nothing comparable. Now, it's an empirical question, of course, but you have to show that some idea is so dangerous that it actually it should dissuade us from pursuing the truth, which is otherwise good. And we'll get it. I think we can get into like the sort of, I have a consequentialist view that ends up being a rule-based utilitarian view that you pursue the truth. Now, I don't think, I'll just say this, I've had this dispute with other people, or friendly dispute, I should call it, about is truth in and of itself a goal? Is it intrinsically valuable? And my answer is no, it's not. It's valuable because it helps humans understand the world and manipulate the world. But we should act as though it is in science, the same way we should in journalism. We should just make the goal for scientists pursuing the truth because that has better consequences for society in the long run. That would be my argument.
So if that weren't true, then you would say no, science shouldn't pursue the truth. If it turned out that on average, let's not say on average, that there are cases when we really should make exceptions that would make the world a better place and it wouldn't be a catastrophe, then we should have those exceptions. And we should say, no, in this case, we shouldn't pursue the truth.
I generally dislike the exceptions principle because what I think happens is that people want to make exceptions, right? They're sort of prone to. And so that's why I go rule based on it. And I say, no, like what we need to do is quarantine science from those kinds of concerns because it's really easy to start to interfere with it in a way that's actually pernicious in the long run. But yes, if somebody showed me, look, like there are two universes or two planets, let's say two planets. One planet doesn't have science, one does. The planet that doesn't have it and doesn't pursue the truth, they're actually a lot happier and everybody gets along and it's a great planet. And then the other planet, they start hating each other, become fractious, whatever. Yeah, I'd pick the planet without truth.
So, in principle, I really like the idea that science should pursue the truth and that should be the goal. And that even, as you say, that we should sort of have a rule about it and we shouldn't make exceptions and we should really that should be the primary thing we're trying to do. However, doesn't science really only exist in the first place, and even social science as well, because we're trying to make the world better? So we're trying to understand aggression, we're trying to understand war, we're trying to understand, probably the first thing is why people can't get along, because we want to make people get along better. We're not trying to understand it because understanding it could make us get along worse, which maybe it does. So almost in some sense, like the invention of science, the actual maybe initial purpose of science is not just to understand, it's to solve problems and to make things better for people. And do we care about that, I guess?
I mean, I'm not saying you're making this, but it's a genetic fallacy to argue that the reason it, the way it was born, so to speak, should affect how we view it now. So I don't care.
Yeah, but I guess I'm saying the reason that we value science, I think, as a society, the reason science gets funded, the reason people talk about science, the reason it gets published in pop media, things like that, isn't really because we just kind of find the truth interesting. It's because we're trying to find solutions to social problems.
So I agree. Well, I think people do find the truth interesting. I think
I would agree with that, but I think if it were only that, then people wouldn't be as interested.
yeah, I agree with that. I, that's why I have like a two-tier approach to this. So I agree with all of that, except for I think all of that works better if we make a deontological system within science that
Mm.
all we're going to do is pursue the truth to the best of our abilities. That actually makes it better from any functional perspective. And
I'm
the danger is when people start trying to interfere with that for their own myopic political interests. That's when you actually gum the works up.
I'm sympathetic to that because I think one of the reasons many people trust science is because we at least sort of pretend that's what we're trying to do, and we try to say that we really are trying to understand the truth, and that we're not being ideologically motivated. Now we'll get to whether that's actually true or not.
Right.
Um, but I agree that people generally don't trust politicians. They don't trust corporations because they have agendas. And if science has an agenda, then we lose trust, and then we just become another one of those. And I think we don't want to be. We don't want to be the media. We don't want to be politicians. We don't want to be corporations. We want to be sort of like above that on another level where we have this sort of like broader goal and we're not specifically trying to accomplish one particular thing. Um,
Yeah, I mean
Again, I don't know if
it's
that's true, but I understand why we would want to have that image. And I
see, I'm
agree
not
that
even concerned about the image, I don't think. Like,
how aren't you concerned about the image?
well, I mean, I am, but that's not the reason that I think pursuing the truth's important. I think having that as a norm. This is why I think the scientific method and the institutions that allow it to thrive, to flourish in Western society, that's a remarkable achievement. The scientific method is not natural. It does not come
Mm-hmm.
naturally to humans.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, it's very important to protect it from potential threats. And one of the threats to it is ideological interests that are not related to the truth. That's one of the threats to the scientific method.
I would
And
argue
that's
though
why I think
that
it's so dangerous.
but I think the reason that's dangerous is because it undermines trust in science, and then people
Sure,
won't
but it,
listen to us anymore. And I would argue in many cases they really shouldn't listen to us anymore. But that's I think that's really the great cost, is that if we are activists and not just purely scientists trying to find the truth,
mhm.
then we are no longer a trustworthy source of information and people won't
Okay,
take us seriously, and then we can't actually impact understanding of the world on a broad level, even if we can in our own tiny communities.
okay, that's fair. I don't, it's an
Which
empirical
again,
question.
now
What,
there's a goal, which is I guess to convince people of what the truth is.
it's an empirical question to me, what's the most like damaging aspect of this? I think it's
Mm.
damaging because yes, it does undermine our trust and the public doesn't take it seriously. It's also damaging because it just messes up the scientific method. It interferes with our ability to pursue the truth. And that's a problem in and of itself too. But I agree, it's an empirical question. I think both are costly, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Um so I guess maybe we somewhat agree that um maybe the goal of science should be pursuing the truth. Maybe that should be prescriptively, that's what we want science to be. So what are the actual goals of social scientists? What does it look like? What do people seem to be doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think this whole thing is really complicated because, again, like probably both you and I have a sort of weird abstract utilitarian philosophy that's interacting with the world as it is and then hypothesizing that the best way to pursue a better world is to create these specialized domains
Mm-hmm.
in which you actually obey rules instead of make utilitarian decisions each step of the way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I just want listeners to be aware of that because ultimately I'm basically a utilitarian. So it's like my philosophy is based on that, but I do think making deontological systems is the best way to pursue the greater good. Now, it's interesting so how have we done a pretty good job of getting sort of political concerns, ideological concerns, religious concerns
Mm-hmm.
out of science, right? Well, no, individual scientists are very motivated by many different things,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Probably
Desire for
first and foremost,
status,
yeah, just desire for status,
right,
publishing interesting things, finding things
right,
people will talk about or whatever, yeah.
right. And if you look at the
We
sociology
have done a
of
pretty good job with religion, though, I think. We really have extracted a lot of religion from science.
well, okay, but so yeah. So if you look at analyses of the sociology of science, which are some of them are really interesting, right? One of the most of them look at like yes, individual scientists want status,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's why they do what they do. It's not because they're noble or something. Um, and they're generally pretty biased individuals, as most of us
Sure.
are. However, as the system is designed, it actually calls out bias. It weeds it out.
Mm-hmm.
It acts as a sieve because people are fighting against each other.
Mm-hmm.
And the best way to win a debate in most science is to be right. So
Yep.
ultimately, if you forward a theory that's not right because of ideological interest, somebody's going to destroy that theory. And when
Yep.
that theory is destroyed, you're going to lose status
And we
and
do have
somebody else
that
is going to
we do
gain it.
have that now more than ever with the replication crisis. If you were if you
Whoa,
were
whoa, that's a bold claim. We have that more than ever?
the calling people out, I think for bad research, yes, I do think we have that more than ever. So if you were pumping out a bunch of studies, a lot of the things that I'm familiar with are, conservatives are horrible in every single way and liberals are better in all of these different ways. If you were doing that, you had a really easy time publishing that in, let's say, the early 2000s. You probably published really good papers, might have gotten a lot of status because this was a popularity in social psychology. But now people are going back and retesting all of these things and failing to replicate a lot of different things, um, and promoting that particular, what I would say was an ideologically motivated idea. You just can't
Mhm.
get away with it the way you could have 10 years ago.
I mean, that's true,
You
but I
have
don't, I think,
your findings have to replicate. If they don't, somebody will call you out
I
eventually
think
if you're
that,
important enough.
I think this has, yeah, I agree with that. But I think this has less to do with replicability and more to do with awareness of political bias. I don't really, I think the reason people are getting called out in the domain you're talking about is because people are much more aware of political bias and they're much more skeptical of
Mm-hmm.
liberally congruent results.
Yes.
But I wonder, okay, so let's wait a second before we get to that, because that's a good point. So let's step back and talk about, so what we're saying basically, and I think you agree with this, or you were saying it too, is that individual scientists might be biased, they're myopic, they're parochial, they're driven by status, they might just want to have sex with somebody, they're trying to impress that person. Who
I
knows
don't
why they're
know
doing
about
what
that,
they're
but okay.
doing,
Yeah.
right? We don't know why they're doing what they're doing. And it doesn't matter, right? That's what we're saying. It's like individual motivation isn't that important because there's a system
Mm-hmm.
that guides in the same way. I mean, in this, again, this isn't new. Sociologists of science have been saying this, and in the same way that the free market, it doesn't matter. Look, you're the CEO of Walmart. It's not like, you know what, I love helping people. It's awesome. They want to make money, and it just turns out that that helps a lot of people. So same thing with science. So we agree basically on
You're
that,
gonna
right?
go on the record saying that Walmart helps a lot of people.
I
Not that
think
the
Walmart
people aren't
helps a
going.
lot of people.
Uh,
we,
I
we
I
can have
I would agree
a
that they do help
podcast about that some
people,
other
and
time.
also they do other things. Yeah. Okay. we won't get into
So,
that.
yeah, so we agree on that. So then the question, okay, so what keeps science honest is a whole system, not
Hmm.
individuals. Now the
Yeah, it's like
question
checks and
is,
balances within the system where if you get status for something,
right,
someone else is going to try to get status by taking you down.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the best way to protect yourself from getting taken down ultimately
Hmm.
is
Is
just to
to
be
be right.
right.
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
So then the question is, okay, but I think what we want to ask is, are there areas, okay, so actually maybe a different question. Does activism thrive in such a way that it actually undermines that process that we're talking about? And I would say yes, and I'll talk about that, but I'm
Explain what you
interested
mean
in.
specifically.
Okay, so it doesn't matter if one individual is a full-blown Maoist
Hmm.
because the sort of system of science will weed that person out. So we're
Hmm.
not, it doesn't really matter that there's one person who believes something.
Hmm.
The question is, has activism, especially in social science, has it undermined the self-correcting nature of science? Is
Yep.
it, and the way that happens, I think, is the way. So let's just think about a different example. Although this is before the institutions of science existed as we knew them, but let's say astronomy and say pre-Copernicus's idea that planets moved elliptically rather than in perfect
Hmm.
circles, or pre-Copernicus, for example.
Hmm.
Certain ideas were just basically ruled out of bounds because so many people, it's not because there was one person who was like, God made planets move in perfect circles. It's just everybody believed that. It was so widespread that other ideas were literally, in some sense, unthinkable.
Right.
So that's what I'm asking is, do we have something
And
similar to that in social
it's
science?
probably harder for individuals to come along and challenge an idea that an overwhelming majority of people,
Right,
99% of people say think is true. Then even
right,
if a handful of people do have a different idea, they might not say anything because they're not going to get status that way. In fact, they're going to lose status that way.
right.
And
So
so
that
I think
means
where
that,
you're going and what I would completely agree with is that yes, that probably is a problem in social science, and this is something we've talked about on Psyphilopod before. I'm pretty sure, although I honestly don't remember what we talked about in the past. But yeah, just the fact that you do have a lot of political homogeneity in the social sciences, and that can disincentivize people from providing the checks and balances and from trying to challenge some of our accepted beliefs.
right. So when there is an overwhelming consensus, like 90% of people in the field agree with something or believe something. And I think, and more importantly, perhaps than that, even, is that those people, at least a minority of those people, are willing to upset the sort of standard system of status allocation in science by besmirching you if you forward an alternative hypothesis, right? I think that's the important thing is that individuals want status.
Mm-hmm.
People do this for their living. They need the money also, right? We can't forget about that. And so if you have a tiny minority even of people who are willing to ruin other people's reputations and get them fired, then the normal process of science in which if you're solving more puzzles, you're usually lauded. If you're the person who says, hey, you know what, like if we accept this hypothesis, this will actually allow us to solve these puzzles.
Mm-hmm.
If instead of like grappling with that empirically, you're just attacked and your moral character is assassinated, and then maybe you get fired or you don't get a lot of status or you're constantly worried about whether you're going to get tenure or not, that disrupts the normal process. That's what I would say, and that's
Yeah,
the big problem.
that is interesting because that means that all of the people who've been participating in the current status structure, who've been working within that framework and have maybe seen some success, they would all be motivated to squash anyone who is trying to alter that status structure and is trying to say, no, we shouldn't be these ideas and these people aren't the people who should be getting all of the attention. It's these other people. So, like, let's take just the replication crisis as a really good example. These are people saying, all of these cutesy effects that have been getting so much attention in the media, that's not what we should care about. We should care about what we're doing, the open science things and replicating. We're not coming up with new ideas, but we're really trying to find out what is true and what is not true, regardless of whether it's cute or not, for example. So that's saying those are now the people that should get status. And a lot of people have reacted to that very negatively, and probably mainly the people who were getting status by, doing what we used to do, which I guess is try to find sort of like cute effects that the media will pick up and people will talk about. Do you disagree with that?
I don't. I mean, I agree with like 80% of what you said. I disagree that that's actually like much of a problem. I think the replication crisis is mostly overblown and rather
No. I'm giving that as an example of people trying to overthrow the means of achieving status.
Okay, no, I agree that there's a bit of a battle about who should get status, and there are people calling out older. Sort of like the old vanguard. Now there's these age-staid people who are like, we were doing it the right way when we had 2 people per cell. Our sample size was 12 and that was fine. But I guess I just see that as mostly a distraction from the more important issues. Like
I'm not talking about what the most important issues are. I'm talking about this is what happens in science and social science when people come along and challenge what the majority of people were doing.
Sure, I agree with that.
That's an example.
You get a status battle, yes. You get it, but I guess the important point is even in that case, it seems as though science is pretty self-correcting. I mean, for one thing, and this is sort of my controversial hot take, I suppose, but I think it's right. For one thing, the stuff that doesn't replicate it's pretty foolish. I mean, most of it's just silly, like cutesy studies that they don't really change anybody's view about the world.
I disagree with you strongly on that, and I think you're just weird. I think
I know I'm weird.
I know you're very weird, but I think a lot of social psychologists would say that their views have changed a lot because of a lot of these effects.
So can you give an example other than ego depletion?
Where people really change their mind on something?
Yeah.
Or that people have potential to change their mind on something. I think a lot of people have changed their mind on the importance of implicit biases. And not everyone is there yet, but a lot of people used to think that those were huge and a really big deal and we should pay a lot of attention. And more people, I think, now are realizing probably not so important.
I think I agree with that one, but I think the implicit bias one is actually an illustration of the danger of political activism in science. It's not really related to like sample sizes or like various how many dependent variables are you using.
Yeah, again, I'm not trying to say that that's what is happening there. I'm just pointing out that is an example of what happens when you have sort of a system in place and everyone's participating in it.
Right, but I hear what you're saying, and I think I agree with the ego depletion, although that one's complicated. But let's.
Yeah, because I think some people still think it's a thing. It is in some sense. I guess it is.
I think it is true in the real world. I think the lab effects are just small, or non-existent. But so it's complicated. But my point about the replication thing is just. It's relatively trivial. It hasn't changed people's view about the world, and that's why nobody really cared. And you're giving the example of the IAP.
I think people do care. I think a lot of I'm saying you're the weird one. People do care.
Okay, so I think that's I think you're misunderstanding what I'm trying to say. So what I'm trying to say is the reason people did these, you know, that we had this going on for 60 years in social psychology,
Mm-hmm.
these small sample sizes with ridiculous studies that were more cute than informative, and, you know, they probably didn't replicate, but nobody really bothered to replicate them, is because none of them really told us very much about humans. That's my contention. Now, I asked, I wanted an example, and you gave me the IAT, which I think is a good example. But I think the IAT is an example of activism. It's not the methods
I
that
would
people were
agree that
using. It's activism.
I would agree that probably the reason people were willing to accept a lot of bad science pre-replication crisis was because they conformed to progressive views about the world. I agree with that completely.
Mhm.
That a lot of the things that either aren't replicating or are maybe not as important as we used to think that they were, a lot of those are because there are things that people wanted to believe. There are things that liberal social scientists wanted to believe were true.
Right,
Yeah,
right,
I would
exactly,
agree with that.
exactly. And I think that's the danger of activism, and it's so it's important to note that it's not just that individuals are biased, because we're all probably biased. It's that the whole system is comprised of individuals who are mostly biased in one direction, right? And that's where you
Yes.
get the danger, because that's where you get something like, and also this is important too, because you have science, then you have the conduit to the masses, and the conduit is the mainstream media, right? The mainstream media is who presents most of the results of science to the public.
Yep.
And the mainstream media are very, very socially liberal on
Yes.
average. Okay.
I think
And so what
even more than social scientists, possibly.
they might very, I mean, something
I
like
think I saw
Vox
that somewhere, but
definitely
now I can't
is.
remember. Um, yeah, because
Right. And
they're
so,
probably less. They're even less tied to the truth, right? So they can.
yes,
Yeah.
I think that's right, because it's important to note the scientists actually work in a world in which your feet are held to the fire to a degree, whereas journalists are
Yeah.
not for the truth. Like
And what
Vox,
they'll do is in a scientific article we present our results and maybe they look liberal friendly or not. But then we have a general discussion where we're much more nuanced and we say maybe it means this, maybe it doesn't. And the media never never
right,
reports on the general discussion. They
right.
only report on the results. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So like I just read this, this was a few days ago. This is an example of that.
Hmm.
So it was, the study is from 2018, and it's terrible. I mean, we can talk about it if we want, but basically what it found was people who, I think especially males who had played a video game in which women were scantily clad were
Hmm.
more likely to send quote unquote sexist jokes to somebody they thought was a partner. It wasn't. It was just a setup.
Okay.
Than somebody who played the same game with not scantily clad women, right? And
Okay.
so, but what's funny about the study is the effect's not that big. And
Hmm.
also another thing the study found was that women were more likely to send sexist jokes, period, than men were.
Did they give
Okay.
examples of what a sexist joke
Yes, they
is?
did, and okay, so let's set that
I
thing
didn't see
aside
that
just for a
one.
second, because they
Mm.
did. This is from 2018.
Okay.
Bushman was one of the authors on this. Okay,
Bushman.
so
Okay.
just I mean, in my opinion, a terrible study, because there are so many alternative explanations, etc. I saw this Screen Rant just wrote this up about, and made it like the headlines basically like, you know, males more sexist after playing game with scantily
Mm.
clad women, and you look through and it basically tells this very social justice story about how we should be very concerned about this. And I'm thinking, look, it's important to keep in mind the effect size is not very big. So the jokes are going from, like, let's say you send 1.9 and you move up to 2.3. Let's
Okay.
say that's it. Okay. Second, the jokes are pretty innocuous jokes. I would just consider them funny, and in a world in which people didn't wilt like flowers, I
Uh-oh.
think most people, yep, I said it, most people should just take those as funny,
Give
because
me an
it's
example. I need an example.
Yeah, I'd have to look it up, and I don't have access to it. It was like, it'd be like something like, how many women does it take to screw in a light bulb? Infinite, because they can never figure it out. Something
Okay.
of that kind of nature. Not, whatever. It's like, who cares, right? Um,
How were they given the opportunity to make sexist jokes? I guess we don't need to get too much
No,
into the
no,
weeds
but
of it.
this is important because this is also left out. I think the Screen Rant article did go over this, but this is often left out when you see it on Twitter or like these headlines. What they did was they told people they were like doing one study about like gaming and one study about jokes, and they actually forced them to send a joke. So they gave them a choice
Hmm.
between a sexist one and a non-sexist one. So I
Oh,
was
they
I was
pre-wrote jokes for
Yes,
them,
and
and then
then
they.
yes,
Oh,
and then I get to choose, do I send one? Which one do I send? Right,
that's
exactly.
lacking
So
in naturalism a little bit.
right, and there are all kinds of problems with
Yeah.
it. Like there are probably uh, not desirability, but demand characteristics,
Hmm.
possibly. Again, how much should we care that somebody thinks it's funny to tell? I mean, there are all kinds of sexist jokes about men that are hilarious. And in fact, some of the jokes in the thing about men I thought were kind of funny. Um,
Yeah, I guess we'd want to
anyways,
know if they make more. Did they make more sexist jokes about men too? Or was that not an
yes,
option? Yeah,
yeah, no. So the women were sending more sexist jokes
about
just in
men.
general about men.
I
They
see.
didn't, the women's didn't change in the
Ah,
condition
got it, got
though.
it. I see.
That's like the big thing, right?
Hmm.
So what happens though is you find this like very tiny, difficult to interpret effect. It gets filtered into the mainstream media and becomes, we found proof that playing games with scantily clad women increases sexism.
Hmm.
That's what happens, and that's why the media are even worse probably than the
Yeah.
scientists. And the same thing happened with the IAT, right? Because to be fair, if you read the science, although in the scientist pop books they get a little extravagant, but
Yeah,
in
that's
the
true.
yeah, but in the peer-reviewed articles on the IAT, most of them were pretty cautious,
Yeah,
right? It's just it
that's
gets
really true.
filtered into the world, and then it's like everybody's a racist is the take-home message, and this has incredibly
Yeah,
pernicious consequences.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's true. That's true. Um, I feel
and
like
no,
I need to go ahead.
well, one thing to note, and this is where I think activism sort of stacks the deck, is if I did the same study, let's take the this sexism study. If I did a study with frankly that terribly designed and ambiguous of results. If I did that, and what I found was, let's say some liberal policy was disastrous. So I did that study, and I found that I don't know. Affirmative action makes people more racist and has terrible consequences.
Hmm.
I doubt it would get published, and I also don't think the media would pick it up.
Well, I
Maybe
don't
the
know about that. I
conservative
don't even
media
know.
would, and that would be unfortunate.
Well, I don't know if there's value in
Well,
speculating
you know
about that.
what? I'm going to criticize my quote unquote my own side. I'm not a conservative, but I mean I'm definitely not a progressive. So there was that study on trigger warnings, and one thing that
Oh, that's right.
yeah, so you remember this study found basically that it actually made people a little bit more likely to be like upset.
Hmm.
It was a terrible study. I mean, like
Yeah.
demand characteristics through the roof, right? And like people were sharing that too and
They
saying,
were.
oh, this, yeah. So I think like it does happen both ways.
Yeah, and also I kind of wanted to call myself out because, um, and maybe you too, because you've been right alongside of me in a lot of what we've been doing, kind of criticizing the political homogeneity in the social sciences and how that's potentially problematic. That's what we're doing right now. Um, is that not activism? Is that any different than
Yeah,
what's
it is different. I
ha-
got that this is actually an argument somebody made to me on
okay?
Twitter, and I think like, yes, we can make a distinction between activism that's corrosive to the scientific method and
Mm-hmm.
activism that's designed to make the scientific method work better to pursue the truth. They're not the same thing.
Yeah, but don't you think that everyone would say that's what they're doing? That everyone.
No. Well, okay, so that's a fair point, but here's what I would say about that. Two things. One, some people wouldn't, but two, I'm not interested in what people say they're doing.
Yeah,
That's
I know, but I tried to be like a little bit like reflective about this because I do think there is this new posse of people in the social sciences that are kind of like the
Are they
enemies.
are they meeting at sunup to have a gunfight?
They meet up sometimes. They're the enemies of the progressive, homogenous social science. They're people that are critiquing.
Sure.
They're doing what we're doing right now. Yoel,
Yes.
Imgar, Lee Jessam, and people like this.
Sure.
Um,
The posse.
I guess John Haidt a little bit. And I think it's I'm very aware that it's its own group now, and I'm aware that I'm part of that group, and I'm aware that probably part of me kind of now sort of favors that narrative, and am I not pushing my own agenda at this point? And I really do think I think I try to be objective, and I try to I try to, I guess, test my hypotheses, and I don't, I don't file drawer any of my findings. I don't, but I don't know. I guess the point is, I think everyone probably thinks they're doing the best job they can in trying to pursue the truth, and
Yeah, that's why I'm utterly uninterested in what they think. I mean, this is like a consistent debate that you and I have, and I just don't care.
I guess I'm saying is what we're doing is what we're doing activism, and if so, is that a problem?
Right, so I'm saying we can make a distinction between activism within science that actually undermines the goal of science as I see it, and as these people see it too, at least according to you, they would say that what they care about is.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned this before, but I told you I like ran a poll on Twitter, and who knows what that is. But but anyway, it was just like, do you care more about pursuing the truth, or do you care more about making the world a better place if you're a social scientist?
Right.
And almost nobody said making the world a better place. Almost no one thinks that's really their goal. Everyone thinks they're trying to pursue the truth, I think.
Sure, maybe. So that's why I don't care about what people think. I think it's a mistake to care. I mean,
I'm not saying that they're right, but I'm saying should that undermine my own feelings that I'm not doing that.
Well, you should be skeptical of your own beliefs and motives, sure, yeah. But I do think there's clearly a distinction between activism, quote unquote activism, that's aimed at making the scientific method work better, and activism that's constantly undermining it. In the same way that there's a difference between activism devoted to protecting the freedom of speech and activism that's undermining it. Of course, somebody could say, well, it's both activism, like, so isn't that activism?
I guess it's like, related to how we started this conversation was that the only kind of activism science should have is pursuit of the truth, and that is activism.
Yeah, sure. But it's a human interest, yes.
But maybe it's different.
Well, it's different because the outcome is different, right? So, I mean, just because first of all, it's not actually perhaps driven by the same thing. I'd have to think about, like, I don't know what all of our motives are. What's John Haidt's motive? I don't know. What's mine? I really don't know. I can say it seems to me. Well, retweets, of course, are part of motives. But it seems to me that there are certain issues that I honestly care about. That I care about the truth on those issues, and people work really diligently to make it difficult to pursue the truth, and that is incredibly irritating to me.
That is true. And I don't think, and I think this is actually something important, and I forget who mentioned this to me recently. I was having a conversation with someone and they said, like, like, well, is that even true? Yeah, so we don't tell them to stop doing what they're doing. We don't tell them to stop pursuing their research in the way that they tell other people to stop pursuing their research and to stop doing what they're doing. But I'm actually not sure that that's true.
I think that's true. I think that's a major
I've
distinction
never
that I
I've
would
never
make.
told anyone that. Although you would say that a lot of what people do is really stupid and it doesn't matter and is a waste of time.
Whoa, wait a second. I would say,
You just talked about this terrible study and like
no, the reason it's okay, but the reason it's terrible is because it's overinterpreted. And yeah, it's bad. I guess I would consider it bad science. It's not because the topic is unworthy of study, though. I think we need to make a distinction there. And actually,
okay.
let's just say this before we get to that. So this is, I think, the one criticism that is important that somebody could forward against what I've been saying, and that is, well, surely the topics that you choose, because you only have a limited amount of time on the
Mm-hmm.
planet, and everybody else does too.
Mm-hmm.
So surely you're choosing topics based somewhat on their importance for society. Like, and I've said this to you, like, I wouldn't devote myself to studying urination patterns in human adults. Although actually maybe somebody has, and maybe it's important for doctors or something. But yes, I think there are probably topics that are so trifling that I wouldn't pursue them, and I don't know that I'd want them published in journals because nobody would care. And so I think that might be the one qualification to this truth thesis, which is there's a small, I think we want to make it small, we want to be cautious about it, but there is a small amount of concern about the topic that you study insofar as if it's completely trivial and has almost no consequences, probably it's not worth getting paid 80 to $180,000 to pursue it. I can kind of see that criticism. Now, I want to note, however, that that's way different from saying you shouldn't study, say, human differences, because that's where people go immediately. They're like, well, what possible benefit would there be to understanding like variation in human intelligence? To which I would respond, what outcome in society isn't affected by IQ? I mean, that's just like, it's bizarre that that would be the next, like the follow up. I was thinking like, yes, if you wanted to study like humans' fascination with sand for your entire career, you'd probably have a hard time getting a lot of publications from it, and maybe that's okay.
Yeah, and I suppose I, if I'm going to critique other research, I might say it's silly, or I might say it's probably wrong, and then I might try to argue about why it's probably wrong, but I wouldn't
Right.
say that you're like a bad person for studying what you're studying. If somebody wants to study why this sort of silly intervention does this thing that it probably doesn't do,
Right.
I would just say, that doesn't seem right to me. But I wouldn't say, your character is now suspect because you're doing that. And in fact, I say this all the time, and you think that it's not a valid point, but I really do think, people generally are, good and trying to do what's best. And so I would really never criticize a scientist by saying that their moral character is in question.
Yeah, but okay, okay, so I agree with you first,
Although
but to
maybe
be
I'm saying the moral character is in question because they're saying other people's moral characters in question.
well, I think that's a fine thing to do. But to be fair, the reason I say that is because look, like again, Robespierre thought he was doing what was good. I don't care about do they think they're doing what's good. I care about what is their idea of the good, right? That's
But
what
I
I'm
do think
concerned
it's
with.
helpful to, just for the purposes of having conversations, I think it's helpful to assume that everybody is good and is trying to be good.
Oh, I don't disagree with that. I think we have that kind of a luxury when we're engaging in
Don't you
scientific
think
discourse to
you'd
be
be, yeah, you'd
charitable.
be more willing to have a conversation with someone if they said, like, I know you're a good person and you want what's best for the world. here's why I think you're
For
wrong,
sure, for
then
sure. And that's what
you're
I would
probably a
say.
piece of shit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And that's what I would say. To my knowledge, I could be wrong about this. To my knowledge, I have never impugned another person's motives, and I've never said they were immoral. I've said they probably are letting ideology dictate what they're studying, and maybe we should think about that. But look, if you want to study the IAT, I don't have a problem with that. I would say that I think it's fair to criticize the methods and the exaggerated conclusions, though. Right? So the
Yeah, well,
problem
more
with
and
that
more people
sexism
are studying the
paper,
IAT, showing that it's, not maybe as big of a deal.
sure, but
Um,
like the problem with that sexism paper, right, is
mhm,
not that sexism is unimportant to study, or
mhm,
even video gaming and sexism is
yeah.
unimportant to study. It's a terrible, you can't learn anything from it.
Yeah.
And so that's my concern with that.
Yeah, so you'd be in favor of studying whether video games can influence sexism, just
Absolutely.
not like that, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. Same thing with violence, right? I mean, although I think at this point the null hypothesis should be they don't really do very much. I think that's what the literature, the careful reading of the literature, leads me to that
Yeah,
conclusion.
that seems
But
to be right.
it's perfectly reasonable to study. I
Mhm.
think what appalls me, and I want to be try to be charitable about it, but it really does frustrate me, and I think it's really unfortunate, and it's an attack on science. Is people who attack your motives for studying perfectly legitimate empirical questions. That is the thing, and the problem is because social science is overwhelmingly progressive, even though most of them don't do that, they're okay with it. They let it happen.
I don't know that they're okay with it. I think that because there is this kind of like moral bullying going on, it's that other people are afraid to say anything about
Yeah.
it because they don't want to be the next target.
Okay,
Certainly,
then
I
I'll
don't
just
say stuff a lot of the time because I don't want to be the next target. Um,
right, but like if this were some liberal issue, we would see that for what it is, namely cowardice,
yeah.
right? So when we talk about this, you remember that poster that every other professor had on his or her door that said, first they came for X and I didn't say anything because I'm not X, then they
Mm.
came for Y and I did it, and then they came for Z, and then they came for me. Right? Which actually the message is a little bit weird because it's suggesting that the reason it's bad not to speak up is because eventually they'll come for you.
Yeah, and not like we should just care about.
Right, we should just
Yeah, we
care
should,
because it's bad that they're killing Jewish people, because I think
yeah.
it's a Holocaust thing. But
Mm.
anyway, we would call that cowardice, right? But
Yeah.
in the domain of social science, so many people let this kind of moral bullying and intimidation
It's
happen.
particularly bad because we always have a larger number of young junior people who are sort of at the mercy of older, more established people. So the
Yeah,
majority of people, the majority of people participating in these conversations or that potentially could participate in these conversations don't have
yeah.
tenure.
Yeah, that's right. So so I guess in that case, it's hard to call those people cowardly because it's totally understandable. And if you have
Mhm.
like a wife and kids and you're dependent, or you have a husband and kids, excuse my implicit sexism, I suppose, then yeah, I understand why you don't want to take a risk and put your neck on the chopping block. On the other
Mhm.
hand, it is really a collective action dilemma because if
Yeah.
all of us came out and said, no, no, you can't do this, we're all going to come out and say what we think and just be honest about it, they would have to chop off a lot of heads. Now, maybe
They
they get
might.
like, maybe they
Yeah.
become the Jacobins and get carried away on the chopping block, but I'm guessing that would actually solve a lot of the problems. But again, it's a hard collective action problem to solve.
Mm,
But one point I want to make here is that one criticism I often get, and maybe you get this, although you're a woman, so perhaps you're a little bit immune from this. There's this common criticism that, well, you're a white male who claims to be objective, and that
mhm.
basically ipso facto means you're biased. And like
Yeah.
everybody's biased, so we should just admit it. And now, what I would say to that is most of the people who make this claim the everybody's bias and like we should just accept our biases. Often they do it as a pretense to just be biased without apologizing for it, which I find a little bit bizarre. So it's like
I don't know that
Gould.
that's necessarily fair because I think
Well,
that
I'll give you concrete examples if you
okay.
want them. So Richard Lewontin, who's still alive, and Stephen Gould, who's dead, both of them were just obsessed with the notion that everybody practicing science was biased, and they were
Hmm.
ideologically biased. Namely, according to Lewontin and Gould, they were right-wing biased, which is risible. I don't know where these people are coming from, but and they clearly it's really difficult to read Lewontin or Gould and come away thinking anything other than that they were massively ideologically biased.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just it's
That
difficult
is
to
the
do.
irony of so many of these conversations, really.
Right, it is,
But that's why I'm trying to call myself out.
well, I think
I
that's
don't want to
good, but
be part of the problem.
I think one cue of bias is moral accusations instead of having empirical disputes.
Yeah, I would agree with that because it's kind of like a last ditch effort or something because you haven't actually come up with a good uh, refutation or something of the point they're trying to make.
Yeah, when people like I was in a Twitter tangle in which I said in which I said, here's a Arthur Jensen review of that you might want to read because in my opinion the Jensen review was utterly devastating and pretty much refuted every point in Stephen Gould's atrocious The Mismeasure of Man. And the person responded by saying he wouldn't take he doesn't care, he's not going to read Jensen because Jensen was a racist and that's the
Mm.
end. And I said something along the lines of, wow, that's a serious empirical argument. And he said, more than Jensen deserves. And that was the end of it.
Hmm.
Now, to me, that is not a serious intellectual engagement. And I would think scientists ought to be embarrassed by that kind of behavior. It may be that these people are good people. I'm not disputing like the underlying goodness of the person's character. Maybe we could go have some tea and have a good conversation, but that's not how you engage in empirical arguments. You don't just dismiss people and say, no, I'm not even engaging that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But
I would,
I do generally agree with the point. I think it's actually probably a good thing to promote the idea that probably all people are biased, even those of us who work really, really, really hard not to be and who try to be like pretty skeptical of our own beliefs. And I just really don't, and I'm not saying that everybody is, but I'm saying that everybody should probably assume that they are and that that would be helpful for them and for other people.
I agree with that. But again, I do think there are people I have discourse with people who seem pretty unbiased to me. They're interested in the evidence, they ask for the evidence, and then they read it. And then there are people who dismiss the people who wrote the evidence because they're racist and they move on with their day. And I think I'm going to call one biased and one pretty unbiased. And I think we should reward one.
You're going to call the people who agree with you unbiased and the people who disagree
No,
with you biased.
no, that's a totally unfair characterization. Not at all. There are plenty of people with whom I disagree pretty intensively, whom I would consider unbiased because they're willing to take a look at the literature and they don't dismiss people with epithets.
I would agree, and I see this. I notice that trait in people as well. That there are people, even people who disagree very strongly with um, me or with whatever information they're engaging with, that they do seem more open and more willing to actually think through the evidence. Um, but nonetheless, even though there are individual differences in that tendency, I do still think it's probably useful for everyone to be aware that they likely are susceptible to being biased, even if they do a better job than other people.
Oh, I
And
totally
I
agree
try
with
to
that.
like think of myself that way, and I find it to be helpful.
I 100% agree with that. I think that is really good. But I do think that one of the ways to help science with the activism problem, because it's a sort of a perpetual problem, because humans have political and ideological interests, and in fact,
Mhm.
our motivation for the truth is not very strong. Like we care more about other things, and so it's really hard to create a
Well,
system
we
that
only
promotes.
care about the truth if it gets us to other things we care
Yeah,
about. Yeah.
exactly. So it's really hard to promote a system that actually encourages the pursuit of, what would you say, like unfortunate truths, truths we don't want to hear, etc.
Hmm.
And one thing we might need to do, and I'm saying this not because I dislike the people, but because I think it's the best way to do it. Some people deserve, like, we need to shame that kind of behavior. That's my, I
I
think
don't
we
like
need.
that.
I know, but that's because you're a squishy progressive.
I just
I
want us
mean,
to be
like,
nice to each other.
I do too. I really do. But it's hard to be nice when somebody is calling you a sexist or a
I don't know
racist or
that
a
shaming them
transphobe.
is the right thing to do, and I think you're just you're stooping to their level at that point. Like I don't if they're calling
I'm
you
not saying we should call them names. I'm saying we should. I mean, what do you do? At some point, they're just going to be kicked out of the realm of rational
we've had pretty
discourse.
intense arguments about this before about what does it mean to shame people uh,
Yeah, I mean,
who
it's
don't
hard to
seem
say
to
what
be
it
pursuing the
means.
truth and who really do just seem to be sort of ideologically motivated and they're just kind of being moral bullies and name calling other people
Right.
and just really not engaging in any sort of like intellectually honest way. And what do you do? Do you just kind of ignore those people? Um, do you call them out? Do you talk about them behind their backs to other people and say this person
Well, of
you can't
course
have
you
a
do
decent
that.
conversation with them? Well, people do that
Everybody
all the
does
time.
that.
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely think civility is one of the most important virtues in discourse. I think it's good because it makes people feel better. It's good because it's more likely to persuade, etc. And I would even maintain civility to somebody who's calling me all sorts of names. I have. But those people are, in some sense, cancerous to the scientific process. They really are undermining it. They're like a rot inside the sort of wood of science, like killing it from the inside. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I would like to just ignore that. Like maybe if we ignore the rot, the tree's really big and strong, it won't matter. But we can see that what has happened lately, say since, I don't know, 2008, something like that. Maybe this isn't true, but like it seems to be true that that rot has spread, right? It's spread, and that's a problem. And I don't know what you do about it. I don't know if you just sit and say, let's be nice to the rot, or do you say, maybe if we're kind to it, it will stop killing the tree? Or do you say, you know what, we're hacking this shit out of the tree and we're getting rid of it? I don't
um,
know.
my approach is like probably generally to ignore the rod.
Okay,
But
but
I'm
I
just
don't
very
know if there's anything
non-confrontational,
noble
so
about that either.
sorry.
Is there anything that's noble about that? I mean,
I'm
it's
not
easy to
saying
be,
it's noble.
okay. I'm
Um,
not either. I'm not very confrontational in that sense either, but I almost
but
think, look,
but it, so you're talking about like hacking these people out. But like is
yeah,
there any
something.
value to like trying to like convert them or
Absolutely. Yeah,
and the way you do that
absolutely.
is by probably being like ridiculously nice and understanding and tell them that they're a good person and I don't know and tell them you respect them and their views and here's why you disagree with them and
Sure, but
even if they're total assholes to you to try to just be as nice as possible back.
oh, I agree. Personally, I would be, but do you think that there's some kind of moral hazard there that you're basically incentivizing people to be crybabies, and like the more you give them, and like okay, so think of the people who took out Noah Carl, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But no, you crossed the line. We're cutting you out. You don't belong in this field of discourse. Sorry. Like, I don't think we should cater to those kinds of people.
Yeah, but then you're just doing to them what they're doing to other people. I don't know if that's the best
No,
long term.
no, that's like saying putting a murderer in jail is just doing to the murderer what the murderer did to other people,
Well,
right?
saying killing the murderers, just doing to them what they did. Yeah, but
No, I'm not saying you should fire these people. I'm saying that somebody has to make it. That kind of intolerance shouldn't be tolerated, I guess is what I'm saying. Right?
oh boy.
I tell you
I don't
this,
know.
if people came after your job, I would not have a lot of sympathy for them and I would go after them.
I think at that point I would probably not have much sympathy either. Maybe I'm just being selfish because I mostly just have like a very small handful of Twitter users with like 8 followers who will occasionally be an ass to me, and I just would ignore them. I don't really have
Okay,
anyone that I care about coming after me.
to be clear, I don't
Of course, I
care
don't
if
really do
Twitter
anything,
people
so
come
I don't
after
know.
me. I have no,
Some people
if
think I'm trying to overthrow the criminal justice system with my provocative work on
that's
free will,
true. That's
but
true, right?
but um,
I'm
I
not
would talk
worried
to those
about
people.
Twitter trolls, by the way. But like,
Yeah.
let's imagine people were as worked up about free will and punishment as they were about, say, race or some other issue, and they came after you.
You've mentioned this before, and I would just say like that's a very silly thing to be so worried about.
It is. It is. I agree. And probably in
And
50
I would say, here's
years,
why you shouldn't be worried about it. Da, da, da.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, in 50 years, maybe people will look back and be like, man, people got worked up about some silly stuff in the 2000s. But they do. So let's imagine these people come after you. They're activists who
hmm
are undermining the scientific method, and you're trying to understand free will and free will beliefs and how do they interact, right? And
hmm
you think there's no free will.
It's not really
You've
free will.
thought about it carefully, you've read a lot of literature, you think there's no free will. Now, imagine you inhabit a world in which this is what you have to do. Either you pretend that you think there's free will, or you shut up and don't tell anybody about it except for the few people who are willing to listen to it and they keep it a secret with you. Or you say, I don't think there's free will. That's my earnest scientific opinion. Of course, I could be wrong, but I've thought about it carefully. And then people come after you. What do you do with the people who come after you? That's my question.
What would I do if people came after me?
What do we do with the people who are going to come after you and morally bully you instead of argue against your positions carefully, civilly, cautiously?
Say, I'm
That's the
sorry, I'll
question.
never do it again.
So, okay, so there's a
We're
quote.
about out of time, so I just wanted to. We're at
Well, there's a
an hour
quote.
and
I would
7 minutes.
rather. I don't know if this is true, but it's a noble quote. I would rather die standing than live on my knees.
So
It
if you
sounds cool. I don't know if I actually would
also
rather.
sounds potentially sexual or something, but
It
uh,
could potentially sound that way. Yes, it was not meant to. I don't think. But
yeah. Well, I don't
okay.
honestly know, but um, complicated problem.
Yes, it's a complicated problem. So here would be my closing statement. If it is it time for that?
It is past time for that. Yeah.
Okay, here's my closing statement. Science is a miraculous achievement of civilization because it's not a natural human tendency. And one thing that the scientific method requires is that people protect and promote the pursuit of truth, no matter where it leads. And it's often going to lead to very unpleasant things because, as we all know, the world is very unlike the way we would want it to be, right? It just turns out we're not that important. We're on a cosmic dust ball floating in an abyss somewhere, and we're just going to die, and that's that. And that's unpleasant. Science has shown us that, and that's, you know, shit, that kind of sucks, right? But but it is better ultimately to know the truth because if we want to manipulate the world, to understand the world, to
hmm
change the world, we have to understand causality. We have to understand what causes what. And pleasant myths, they may feel good temporarily, but in the long run, they actually undermine our ability to implement effective policy. So, what I would do is I would quarantine science. I would say, especially in social science, this is a truth only domain. Keep your Marxism out on the other side. If you're a Marxist, good for you. Cool. But don't bring it into the scientific sphere. That's what I would say.
Yeah, well, the point you're really making there is that really the point of science is to make the world a better place. And the way we do that is by pursuing the truth. And I think that's probably generally true, and that you're right. If we identify tons of teeny tiny interventions that don't really do anything, all we're doing is wasting people's time and money, which is a lot of what we've been doing. And inevitably, if we're ever going to come up with effective ways to make the world a better place, it's best to start with valid information.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
to me, then, it's not really about pursuing the truth. It is about making the world a better place. It's just by doing it by pursuing the truth.
Sure, but I think this is an important, this will be like the sort of comparison I would want to make as I end this. So journalists, the job of journalists should be to tell the truth, because that's the importance of the institution of journalism, even though that's sometimes unpleasant. So I give the concrete example of the Columbine shooting. There was this woman, I think it's Cassie, but I forget her name. She was killed in the Columbine shooting tragically, and this story popped up about her that I think Dylan had asked her, do you believe in God? And she said yes, and was shot for it. And she was this kind of martyr. And even her parents wrote, I think her mom did, wrote a book about her called She Said Yes. No, it turns out it wasn't true. He had asked somebody else that question, and I think he didn't even shoot that person, and he just happened to shoot Cassie because he was a sick, sadistic son of a bitch. And some journalist ended up breaking this, that it wasn't true. And you can see that's terrible. It's terrible to the family. It sucks a lot of meaning out of her death because they, thought she was some martyr for her new beliefs. A lot of people had heroized her, and all of a sudden the story is gone. And a lot of people were angry with the journalist, and I can understand that. But they shouldn't have been. They should have been angry with the people who made the myth in the first place. And so even though in the short term telling that noble lie feels good to people, in the long run the truth is generally better. And what we need to do is encourage individuals in the system to the best of their ability to pursue the truth, even though it might be uncomfortable ephemerally.
All right, we'll close there.
Okay.
All right, later.